Sipping a thick, cold cup of black coffee on a dreary November morning in suburban Oregon, I suddenly realized I had become a ghost in my own home. This four-bedroom wooden house, once packed with laughter, the bickering of children, and the smell of my late wife's cinnamon rolls, is now frighteningly silent. It's ironic how you spend your entire youth building a bustling home, only to end up spending your final years in a thick silence, a silence that can erode a person's mind day by day. Do you ever wonder where your value lies when your children take flight and leave you stranded amidst a pile of dust-covered memories? I am Arthur, 82 years old, a former structural engineer who dedicated over 40 years of my life to high-rise buildings in downtown Chicago. During those years, my hands grew calloused from steel and blueprints, my back hunched from sleepless nights rushing to meet project deadlines. I was used to controlling everything, calculating precisely down to the millimeter to ensure no building would collapse under the pressure of storms. Yet, damn it all, I am completely powerless to keep my relationship with my own flesh and blood from cracking and collapsing. My son Richard is now a bank executive in Silicon Valley, and my youngest daughter Sarah manages a chain of upscale restaurants all the way on the East Coast. They are both successful, wealthy, and so busy that time spent on a widowed old man on the other side of the country seems to be an unaffordable luxury. I vividly remember my first day moving to this tiny town in Oregon in 2014, right after my wife passed away from a severe illness. At the time, both Richard and Sarah swore they would take turns flying back to visit me once a month, or at the very least, video call me every Sunday evening. For the first few months, everything played out just like the script of a model family. Hours-long calls filled with cheerful laughter about work and the grandchildren. But time truly is a cruel thief. It not only takes away your youth, but also steals people's patience and compassion. The gap between calls gradually widened, from once a week to once a month, and eventually reduced to just brief greeting messages on holidays. Do you know the bone-chilling feeling of hopelessly waiting for a message notification? It's like standing in the middle of a deserted train station, holding a ticket for a train that ceased operations decades ago, yet stubbornly believing the train whistle will blow on the horizon. I had turned into a pathetic addict, constantly clutching a cold tablet, startled by every spam email notification, just because I thought it was a message from the kids. That waiting eroded my dignity, turning a man who once commanded hundreds of construction workers into an emotional beggar, scraping by each day on the measly crumbs falling from my children's busy banquet tables. There were nights I stayed awake until 3 a.m, staring at a glaring screen, scrolling back and forth on Richard's social media profile to see him vacationing in Europe with clients, or looking at photos of Sarah radiantly cutting the ribbon for her new restaurant. They are living absolutely wonderful, brilliant, and energetic lives. It's just that in that perfect picture, there is absolutely no room for a slow, forgetful old man. Sometimes I proactively called, but the other end was frequently a lifeless dial tone, indicating the line was busy, or if they did pick up, it was a rushed, superficial voice. "Dad, I'm about to go into a meeting, I'll call you back later." That was the familiar mantra I had to hear hundreds of times over 3 agonizing years, and of course there was never a call back. I realized I had become a psychological burden, a mundane task sitting at the very bottom of their daily to-do lists. The feeling of being treated as an obligation is 1,000 times worse and more humiliating than being completely forgotten, my friends. One afternoon in April last year, I accidentally found my old diary from 1986, the time I had to mortgage the house we were living in to cover Richard's heart surgery costs. Back then, I worked 3 shifts a day, ate stale hamburgers from convenience stores, and fell asleep on the steering wheel of my truck, just to scrape together every spare penny to pay off the medical bills. I traded my entire youth, my health, and my blood, sweat, and tears without a second thought, because that is the instinctual drive of a father protecting his flesh and blood. However, love is not a financial investment that yields returns. You cannot expect your kids to pay you back exactly what you sacrificed for them. Children are like arrows, shot from their parents' bow. They only dart forward, aiming toward their own futures, and rarely bother to look back at the person who used their entire being to draw that bowstring. Why do we torture ourselves by trying to cling to things that have slipped out of our grasp, instead of accepting letting go to find peace? The greatest collapse didn't come from some earth-shattering event, but it came on a bitterly cold Thanksgiving Day last year. I spent 3 whole days cleaning the house, manually preparing a massive chestnut-stuffed turkey, and buying the finest bottles of wine from the Napa Valley, just because Sarah vaguely mentioned that her whole family might drop by. I turned on the fireplace, put on classic Frank Sinatra jazz records, sat in my worn leather armchair, and waited for the doorbell to ring. Time dragged on as heavy as lead, from 6 in the evening to 8 o'clock, then 11 at night. The turkey had gone completely cold on the large dining table, and the unopened bottle of wine became the most bitter mockery of my naivety. At 11:15 that night, my phone notified me of a message from Sarah. A brief and emotionless line of text appeared on the screen, saying their flight was canceled due to a blizzard, and they had decided to go skiing in Colorado instead of coming to visit me. Not a single explanatory phone call, not a single sincere apology, just a cold notification, much like how someone cancels a dentist appointment. That night I dumped all the food into the trash, smashed the expensive bottle of wine into the corner of the kitchen, and sat sobbing in the dark like a child stripped of their favorite toy. But then, in the depths of my humiliation and outrage, a flash of realization suddenly lit up inside my wrinkled and gray-haired head. I suddenly understood that the root cause of all this suffering wasn't because my kids were heartless, but because I had entrusted all my joy, happiness, and meaning of life into their hands. I had turned into an emotional parasite, leeching off the meager bits of attention from my children to survive, losing the self-respect and pride of a man who once built an empire with his bare hands. I couldn't continue living such a weary, pathetic life anymore. I had to sever the invisible shackles that had bound my spirit for so many years. The very next morning, I drove my beat-up old Ford pickup truck all the way to the telecom office downtown and demanded the clerk cancel my entire internet contract and expensive mobile data plan. The young clerk looked at me like a lunatic dropped from another planet when I asked to switch to a classic landline phone, one that only had calling capabilities and absolutely no caller ID screen. I walked out of the store, holding the modern smartphone in my hand, the very thing that had been the handcuffs imprisoning my soul, and hurled it straight into the deep lake below the town's overpass. A tiny splash echoed, yet it triggered a massive explosion of liberation in my mind, sweeping away all the suffocation, anxiety, and delusional expectations that had accumulated over many long years. From that moment on, my world was no longer confined to those damned red notification dots or lifeless message chimes. I had built an invisible fence with my own hands, not to lock myself in, but to block toxic expectations from invading and ravaging what was left of my short life. That was merely the first step of a grueling yet incredibly liberating journey of rebirth that an old man like me was about to embark on. During the first few weeks after throwing away that damned smartphone, I felt like an addict in rehab, wrestling with withdrawals. My body had formed a terrible conditioned reflex. Every 5 or 10 minutes, my right hand would unconsciously reach into my pocket searching for that cold block of metal. Sometimes I even hallucinated, hearing the message notification chime echo in the dead of night, waking up startled and drenched in sweat, only to realize it was just the crickets chirping on the lawn. Going through that feeling of attention withdrawal was not pleasant in the slightest. It forced me to directly confront the most primal loneliness of a human being. But my friends, it was precisely within that deafening silence that I began to hear the sounds I had missed for so many years, the creaking of the wooden floorboards, the wind howling through the chimney, and even the sound of my own heartbeat. I wandered around the vast house like a lost ghost, looking at the layers of dust blurring the family photo frames. and suddenly realized I had wasted far too much time waiting for pipe dreams. On the Wednesday morning of the second week, I decided to push open the garage door, a place containing a whole treasure trove of the past that I had sealed shut since the day I moved to Oregon. The smell of old lubricating grease, the rust of steel, and the mustiness of construction blueprints hit my nose directly, awakening every sense in this aging body. I dragged out my stainless steel toolbox from my working days in Chicago, tracing my age-spotted fingers over every wrench, spanner, and laser measure. The feeling of metal touching my flesh was so real and solid that it almost brought me to tears. I wasn't a useless man waiting to die. I was once a structural engineer, after all. In 1988, I was assigned to supervise the foundation reinforcement of an old apartment building on the south side of Chicago that was at severe risk of subsiding. At the time, the contractor wanted to use cheap materials to temporarily patch the surface, pulling the wool over the authorities' eyes and saving costs, but I adamantly refused and demanded it be demolished to completely pour new reinforced concrete pillars. I told the project manager that you cannot build a solid future on a rotten foundation. Sooner or later it will collapse and drag everything down to the grave with it. Thinking back now, that construction philosophy was the exact thing I had forgotten in building a life for my final years. I had been trying to patch up my cracking family foundation with concessions, with servile begging for my children's affection, instead of digging deep into myself to create a newer, more solid foundation. Never turn yourself into an emotional doormat for others to trample on, even if they are the children you gave birth to and raised yourself. Motherhood or fatherhood is not a free pass for them to have the right to ignore your existence and treat you like a dusty piece of furniture in the corner of the house. You dedicated your entire life to being a solid foundation for them to soar high. Now is the time you must build a home for your own soul. Is it worth it to lock yourself in a prison of your own making just out of the fear of being forgotten by people who are already busy with their own skies? Hold your head high, clear out the rubble in your mind, and get to work rebuilding your life, because no one else but you can do it. I started by heading over to the house of my old neighbor named Elias, a grumpy Marine veteran with chronic arthritis, who was struggling with the rotting wooden fence in his backyard. I carried my toolbox over, didn't say a word, tossed him a cold can of beer, and quietly measured, sawed, and hammered away for an entire sunny weekend afternoon. Initially, he grumbled in annoyance at my abrupt appearance, but when he saw the oak planks securely reinforced and perfectly straight, his eyes completely changed. That afternoon, us two old guys sat on the sawdust-covered grass, sipping bitter beer and talking about blizzards up north, about muscle cars from the 70s. It had been a long time since I'd had a proper conversation between two grown men, no judgment, no pity, just respect for the simplest efforts of manual labor. Things might have just peacefully coasted along like that if a winter storm hadn't struck in early November, bringing gale-force winds and blinding sleet that tore through the night. While sitting carving a piece of maple wood next to the fireplace, I was startled by a frantic and violent pounding on the door, as if wanting to smash the hinges to pieces, accompanied by hoarse screaming echoing from the porch. I grabbed the baseball bat kept handy in the corner of the wall, cautiously cracked open the thick oak door, only to be stunned to see Richard, my brilliant son, standing there, soaking wet and shivering like a drowned rat. He barged into the house, panting and yelling in a tone full of outrage mixed with sheer panic, asking why my phone had been disconnected for 3 weeks, why emails went unanswered, and my social media accounts were wiped clean. He said he thought I had rotted away dead in this house, had called the local police, but they refused to check because the roads were blocked by the blizzard, forcing him to drive over 10 hours from the Portland airport to get here. I looked at the boy, a powerful bank executive who always draped himself in designer suits worth thousands of dollars, now looking haggard, panicked, and furious like a child stripped of his familiar toy. To be honest with you all, if it were me a month ago, I would have undoubtedly burst into tears, hugged him tightly, and profusely apologized for making him worry, hastily explaining everything, hoping to garner sympathy. But at that moment, I simply and calmly set the baseball bat down, poured a piping hot cup of black coffee, pushed it toward him, and pulled up a chair to sit opposite him with an incredibly composed demeanor. I let him vent all his frustration, all his reproaches about my irresponsibility, about how I had disrupted his busy schedule just because of a turned-off phone, waiting until he screamed himself hoarse and flopped down into the chair gasping for breath. I slowly took a sip of coffee, staring straight into his bloodshot eyes without even blinking. I bluntly told Richard that I hadn't gone missing, but had merely smashed the tool that was turning me into someone wasting away begging for every little scrap of my children's time. Amidst the quiet room filled only with the howling wind and crackling fire, I firmly announced my resignation from the position of the father standing waiting by the window. I demanded that if my kids wanted to see me, they should drive here themselves or call the landline, and asserted that they had no right to be angry when a connection they themselves had neglected suddenly ceased to operate. That resolve left Richard stunned, unable to believe these were the words of an old man once deemed senile. Respect cannot stem from servility or unconditional sacrifice, but begins with bravely establishing and defending one's personal boundaries. Instead of throwing away your self-esteem in exchange for a few empty greetings, define your own life with pride and stop letting others dictate your worth. Being a good father doesn't mean turning into an invisible shadow. You must live fully so your children admire you, not pity you. That night, Richard quietly left early, but the old family dynamic had permanently changed. I was no longer chasing and he was no longer running away. Everything gradually got better as my children began to respect the new boundaries. Richard called to ask for professional advice from a structural engineer instead of comforting an old man, while Sarah wrote a handwritten apology letter and promised to bring the grandkids to visit. At the same time, I found new joy volunteering to teach technical drawing to the youth, enjoying the sense of freedom and the powerful revival in my soul. Old age is not a dark waiting room for death, but a free workshop for us to mold the rest of our lives. It is time to extinguish meaningless expectations and light the fire of passion for oneself. I told him that I hadn't gone missing. I was still here, in the very house that you kids promised to visit 4 years ago but never once managed to. I told him that I didn't destroy my means of communication. I merely smashed the thing that was turning me into a lowly beggar, waiting for the crumbs of time that you threw at me like throwing bones to a dog. Silence enveloped the entire living room, leaving only the crackling of pine wood in the fireplace and the frantic howling wind outside the window. Richard stood stunned with his mouth agape, seemingly unable to believe those steely words were coming from the mouth of a senile old man. I continued without the slightest tremble that from now on I resigned from the position of someone standing waiting by the window. If you kids really want to see me, drive here yourselves, or call the landline and leave a message after the beep. You have no right to get angry when a switch you have neglected to turn on for years suddenly no longer lights up at your command. Respect is never naturally born from servility or unconditional sacrifice. It only appears when you know how to establish clear boundaries and bravely defend them to the very end. When you stop chasing after others, stop throwing away your self-respect in exchange for a few empty greetings. That is exactly when you force them to reconsider your true value. Have you ever asked yourself who you would be if stripped of the title of father or mother? If you no longer had to worry about children who have grown up and have their own lives? Don't let your life be defined by how others treat you, but define it yourself by how you choose to live and react to the world around you in the proudest way possible. Becoming a good father doesn't mean becoming an invisible man. Live a full and deeply proud life so that they have to admire you, not pity you. That night, Richard slept on the living room sofa. The next morning, he quietly left early at the crack of dawn, leaving only a $100 bill tucked under a coffee cup out of an unconscious habit. But something had permanently changed in our worn-out family dynamic. The control had shifted hands. I was no longer the one chasing, and he was no longer the one running away. About 3 weeks later, the antiquated landline phone sitting in the corner of the living room suddenly rang. I let it ring to the fourth chime before slowly picking up. On the other end was Richard's voice, more hesitant and cautious than ever. He didn't say the usual empty platitudes, but asked me about a pre-engineered steel building design he was planning to invest in. He needed the advice of a seasoned structural engineer, not the comfort of an old dad. We talked about safety factors, wind loads, and the deflection of steel beams for almost an hour and a half, a high-quality, equal, and highly professional conversation that I had craved for so long. Then came Christmas, and I received a package sent from New York. Inside were not the expensive gifts hastily bought online like every year, but a handwritten letter in blue ink from Sarah. She admitted being deeply shocked hearing her brother recount the story of the blizzard night. She apologized for getting caught up in the whirlwind of work and promised to bring the grandkids to visit me next summer. I read that letter twice, folded it carefully, tucked it into my drawer, then slipped on my boots and stepped out into the freezing snow to go to the county's community vocational center. I had signed up to volunteer there, teaching teenage kids how to read basic technical blueprints and how to calculate material quantities for residential carpentry projects. There is nothing more wonderful than seeing the shining eyes of a 19-year-old kid when they manually draw a complete cross-section diagram under the guidance of an experienced old craftsman. I have new friends again, the grumpy old men in the woodworking shop, the noisy but eager to learn students. I have new projects, new blueprints waiting to be completed on my workbench. My body still aches whenever the weather turns cold. My knees still creak when climbing stairs. But my soul seems to have been reborn, stronger and freer than at any point in the past 2 decades. I realize that old age is not a dark, silent waiting room for death, but a free workshop where you can mold the rest of your life into any shape you desire. Are you ready to extinguish the meaningless expectations of your children's reciprocation and light the fire of passion yourself for these deeply proud final years? I am Arthur, 82 years old, a retired structural engineer, a free man living in a small wooden house in the rainy and chilly suburbs of Oregon. My landline phone sits quietly on the wooden desk in the corner of the room. It might ring or it might not, that no longer matters, and it doesn't affect my mood in the slightest. I have a good book I haven't finished reading, an unfinished blueprint for a tomato greenhouse, and a piping hot, steaming cup of coffee on my sawdust-covered workbench. This life is too short to spend hours staring at a phone screen just waiting for someone to remember your existence. Leave a comment below if you are also going through something similar. Don't forget to press like and subscribe so we can continue chatting together in the next videos.